The room knew her before it remembered her. Crystal chandeliers scattered light like controlled explosions across the ballroom of the Marina Bay Sands, reflecting off black tuxedos, silk gowns, polished smiles. The Global Frontier Tech Laureates Gala had begun exactly on time, exactly as planned. Every detail calibrated to signal power, money, and inevitability. This was a room built to confirm who mattered. And then Imani Brooks walked in. For half a second, nothing happened. Conversations continued, glasses clinked, laughter rose and fell in practiced waves. Then something shifted, subtle, almost imperceptible. A pause here, a glance there, as if the air itself had inhaled and forgotten how to exhale. At the base of the grand staircase, Graham Whitaker stopped laughing. His hand froze mid-gesture, champagne flute tilted at a dangerous angle. The man beside him kept talking, unaware that Graham's face had gone pale, that his eyes had locked onto a figure across the marble floor, like he'd seen a ghost wearing flesh. Imani didn't look at him. Not yet. She moved with unhurried precision, each step deliberate, her presence calm but undeniable. The dress she wore wasn't loud, no sequins, no excess, but it commanded attention anyway. Structured shoulders, clean lines, black fabric that absorbed light instead of begging for it. A dress designed not to decorate, but to occupy space. 6 years ago, she had entered rooms like this silently, invisibly, as an accessory to someone else's importance. Tonight, the microphone on the stage bore her name in brushed gold. Imani Brooks, guest of honor. A ripple of recognition spread through the crowd as people followed the engraved letters, then followed the letters to the woman walking toward the center of the room. Phones slipped quietly from pockets. Someone near the bar whispered, "Wait, that's her?" Graham's jaw tightened. His smile, so reliable, so rehearsed, failed to assemble in time. Because this wasn't just a woman returning to a city that had once dismissed her. This was the woman he had loved in private and erased in public. His wife. The one he never claimed. And before we go any further, if stories about power, betrayal, and reclaiming your worth resonate with you, take a second to like this video, follow the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. These stories live because people like you keep them alive. Imani reached the edge of the crowd and finally stopped. She let the moment stretch, let the silence do its work. Years ago, she would have shrunk under this many eyes, wondered what she was allowed to take up. Now she simply stood, letting the room adjust around her. Singapore had taught her a hard truth. Global cities didn't run on fairness, they ran on perception. And perception had once been used against her. 3 years earlier, this same city had known her only as a shadow. Graham Whitaker's associate, a consultant from the States, someone passing through. Never his wife, never a founder, never the mind behind a biomedical wearable that could detect early cardiac irregularities with frightening accuracy. Back then, Graham had been the kind of man people leaned toward when he spoke. White, American, effortlessly confident. A senior partner at a venture capital firm that decided which startups lived and which quietly died. He wore progressiveness like a tailored jacket, comfortable, flattering, easily removed when inconvenient. Imani had believed in him once, believed that love could coexist with ambition, that brilliance would eventually speak for itself. She had been wrong about one of those things. Now, as applause began, hesitant at first, then growing, Imani lifted her gaze and let it travel across the ballroom. She saw recognition dawning on faces that had once looked past her. She saw curiosity, calculation, opportunism. She saw journalists already rewriting their mental headlines. And finally, she looked at Graham. Their eyes met. For a heartbeat, the past tried to pull her backward, to a glass-walled apartment overlooking the Singapore skyline, to whispered phone calls, to invitations that never included her name, to the slow, quiet realization that she had been edited out of her own life. Then the moment passed. Graham looked away first. Imani exhaled, a small breath, steady and grounding. She hadn't come here for revenge. She hadn't come for closure. She had come because something powerful happens when the person you tried to erase returns with proof that they were never small, only hidden. A voice echoed through the ballroom as the host stepped up to the podium. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, smiling wide, unaware of the personal earthquake beneath his feet. "Tonight we honor innovation that doesn't just disrupt markets, but changes lives." Imani straightened. The city that once made her invisible was about to listen, and this time she would make sure it heard every word. The apartment was perfect in the way hotel suites are perfect. Immaculate, expensive, and untouched by evidence of a real life. Floor-to-ceiling glass wrapped around the 42nd floor, offering a panoramic view of Singapore's skyline. Steel towers, surgical lines of light, the quiet assertion of wealth rising from the water. Every surface reflected something: light, movement, status, but absorbed nothing. No warmth, no history. Imani learned quickly how to move through it. She learned which chairs were for sitting and which were for looking at, which shelves were decorative, which were off limits entirely. She learned not to leave her notebooks on the coffee table, not to drape her jacket over the back of a chair. She learned how to fold herself into the space so completely that it seemed she had never entered it at all. Graham called the apartment minimalist. Imani thought of it as a showroom. Most mornings, Graham left before sunrise. His suits hung in the closet like obedient soldiers: navy, charcoal, black, pressed and identical. He kissed her cheek with practiced affection, already halfway gone, already checking his phone. "You don't need to come today," he'd say easily, slipping on his watch. "It's just internal meetings, boring stuff." At first, she believed him. She told herself she preferred the quiet, that she needed uninterrupted hours to work on her prototype, to refine the sensor array that lived half-assembled on a folding table in the smallest room of the apartment, the one Graham referred to as the guest room, even after she'd converted it into a workspace. It was the only place where her fingerprints were allowed. In that room, wires spilled freely across the desk. Circuit boards lay stacked like unfinished thoughts. The air smelled faintly of solder and coffee gone cold. On the wall, diagrams bloomed in organized chaos, heart rhythms mapped in careful lines, algorithms rewritten again and again until they behaved the way she needed them to. In that room, Imani existed fully. Everywhere else, she was carefully edited. At industry dinners, Graham introduced her with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. "This is Imani," he'd say, nothing more. No title, no context. The pause after her name did the rest of the work, inviting assumptions he never corrected. People assumed she was junior, peripheral, temporary. She noticed how conversations shifted around her, how Graham's hand sometimes pressed lightly against the small of her back. Not possessive, but guiding, steering her away from topics that wandered too close to visibility. She noticed how invitations arrived addressed to him alone, how +1s were theoretical, never spoken aloud. When she asked, gently, at first, he answered gently too. "You know, protected," it turned out, meant unseen. Imani had spent her life learning how to be excellent. Growing up in Baltimore, excellence had been armor, degrees earned, grants won, publications stacked. She'd learned that if she worked twice as hard, spoke half as much, and never made anyone uncomfortable, the world might allow her a seat at the edge of the table. She hadn't realized Graham had taken notes. He loved her brilliance in private. The late nights, the sketches, the way she spoke about biomedical ethics with quiet fire. He loved telling people, carefully chosen people, how impressive she was, how driven, but always as an aside, a footnote, never the headline. And still, she stayed, because leaving would have required naming what was happening. And naming it would mean accepting that love alone was not enough to overcome fear. His fear of donors, of boards, of being seen as different in a world that rewarded sameness. Some nights, she stood at the window long after the city went dark, watching lights blink out one by one, wondering when she had agreed to make herself this small, wondering how a life could be so comfortable and feel so tight around the chest. The truth crept in slowly, the way hard truths do, not as a revelation, but as accumulation. A canceled invitation here, a whispered phone call there, a future always discussed in theory, never in public. Her life had been curated carefully, just not for her. And without knowing it yet, Imani was approaching the moment when she would finally understand the cost of living as someone else's quiet achievement, admired, contained, and hidden away from the light. Imani met Graham Whitaker on a Tuesday afternoon in Boston, in a conference hall that smelled faintly of burnt coffee and ambition. The Northeast Health Tech Forum was already halfway through its second day, long enough for most people to be tired, guarded, and impatient. Investors moved through the aisles like predators with polite smiles, scanning badges, calculating returns before conversations even began. Founders stood beside poster boards and folding tables, rehearsing confidence while quietly bracing for dismissal. Imani hadn't slept the night before. Her prototype rested on the table in front of her. A slim, unfinished wearable, wrapped in matte black casing, wires hidden beneath precision engineering. It wasn't flashy. It didn't need to be. It could detect early cardiac anomalies, weeks before standard monitoring, using a machine learning model she had trained herself on thousands of anonymized datasets. Most people walked past without stopping. A few glanced, nodded politely, then drifted toward louder booths with bigger banners and shinier promises. Imani adjusted her notes, smoothed the edge of her blazer, and told herself, again, that visibility wasn't the same as value, that the right person would understand. Then Graham stopped. He didn't interrupt her mid-sentence the way others did. He didn't glance at his phone. He stood there, actually stood, watching the data visualizations scroll across her tablet, following the rhythm of her explanation as if it mattered. She noticed his shoes first, polished, expensive, worn like someone who didn't think about them. Then his posture, relaxed, confident, unafraid of taking up space. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, curious. "You're not just monitoring the heart," he said. "You're anticipating it." Imani blinked. Most people reduced her work to buzzwords. Preventative care, AI-driven health. But this meant he'd listened. She nodded slowly. The body gives warnings before it fails. We just don't teach ourselves how to hear them. Graham smiled then, not wide, not performative, the kind of smile that feels like recognition. "I'm Graham," he said, offering his hand. "I think this might be the most interesting thing I've seen all day." The words landed softly, dangerously. They talked for 20 minutes, then 40. People came and went around them, but Graham stayed, asking questions that cut to the heart of her work. He asked about ethics, about bias in medical data sets, about what it meant to build technology that would be trusted by people whose bodies had historically been ignored. No one had ever asked her those questions in a pitch. By the time the hall lights dimmed for the next keynote, Imani felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Seen, not as a token, not as a novelty, as a mind. Graham told her about his firm, global, influential, known for spotting category-defining founders. He spoke about capital like a tool, not a weapon, about mentorship, about partnership. "I don't just invest in ideas," he said, leaning closer as the crowd thickened. "I invest in people who can change the shape of an industry." When he asked her to dinner, it didn't feel transactional. It felt earned. Boston in early spring was still cold. They ate at a small restaurant near the harbor, talked until the staff began stacking chairs. He listened when she spoke about growing up in Baltimore, about being the first in her family to pursue engineering, about learning early that brilliance alone wasn't always enough. "I hate that the world makes it harder than it needs to be," he said quietly. She believed him. Within weeks, he was flying to see her. Within months, he was talking about the future as if it were something they were building together. He told her she was extraordinary, and unlike others who had said it before, he seemed to understand what that cost. When he proposed, it wasn't with a ring at first, but with a vision. "We could do this together," he said one night, standing in her tiny apartment, surrounded by schematics taped to the walls. Your mind, my resources, we'd be unstoppable. The ring came later. The move came quickly. Singapore, he said, was where the real influence was shifting, where decisions were made quietly, globally. Imani hesitated. Her work was just beginning to gain traction. Her independence mattered. Graham took her hands, steady and warm. I would never ask you to shrink, he said. I want the world to see what I see. That was the moment she said yes. What she didn't know then, what love sometimes disguises until it's too late, was that being seen by one person can feel so powerful, so necessary, that you don't notice when everyone else slowly stops seeing you at all. And by the time she realized the difference between recognition and possession, the life they had built together was already beautifully, carefully closed around her. The first time Imani noticed she was missing, it was in a photograph. It appeared on Graham's social feed the morning after a venture dinner in Singapore. A wide shot of a private dining room overlooking the river, all glass and candlelight, and men in dark suits leaning comfortably into their importance. The caption read, "Productive night with partners and friends. Big things ahead." Imani scanned the image once, then again, her thumb hovering uselessly over the screen. She remembered that dinner, remembered the way she'd sat beside Graham, smiling politely as conversation skated around her. Remembered the way a waiter had refilled his glass twice before asking if she wanted anything. Remembered how Graham's hand had rested on her knee under the table, grounding and quiet, as if to say, I see you, even while the camera had not. She wasn't in the photo. At first, she assumed it was a crop, a simple mistake. Someone else had taken the picture. Maybe she'd leaned back. Maybe she'd been looking away. But the next week, it happened again. And again, Imani began to notice a pattern she couldn't unsee. Group shots from conferences, casual selfies at rooftop bars, panels, dinners, celebrations. Graham was always centered, always visible. She was never framed, never tagged, never named. Sometimes she appeared as a sliver of arm at the edge of a shot, a blur of dark fabric near the margin, proof that she had been there, but not enough to count. She didn't accuse him. Not yet. She told herself the world didn't revolve around Instagram, that adults didn't measure love by pixels. Still, something inside her tightened every time she scrolled. In public, Graham was effortless. He shook hands easily, laughed at the right moments, spoke with calm authority about innovation and ethics. People listened to him. People trusted him. When he said we in conversations about the future, they assumed he meant his firm, his partners, his peers. Never her. At networking events, introductions came with subtle erasure. This is Imani, Graham would say smiling. Just Imani. No title, no explanation. The pause after her name invited speculation, and most people filled it quickly. Consultant, analyst, assistant, girlfriend maybe, temporary. Once a woman from a European fund leaned in and asked Imani, conspiratorial in kind, "So how long are you in Singapore for?" Imani hesitated, then smiled. "Indefinitely." The woman blinked, surprised. "Oh, that's exciting." She turned back to Graham before Imani could explain. Imani began to hear things she hadn't heard before. Not because people were cruel, but because they assumed she wasn't important enough to be careful around. "She's sharp," one man said at a cocktail event, nodding in Imani's direction while speaking directly to Graham. "You mentoring her?" Another time, a junior associate congratulated Graham on his focus for not letting personal life distract from business. "Must be hard, traveling so much without attachments." Graham laughed, didn't correct him. At home, when Imani asked, softly, cautiously, Graham brushed it aside. "You're reading too much into it," he said, loosening his tie. "Not everything needs to be a statement." But it was always a statement. Silence is a statement. Absence is a statement. The worst part wasn't that people didn't know she was his wife. It was that, slowly, she began to feel like she wasn't. When she looked back through her own phone, she saw the contrast clearly. Her photos were quiet, lab benches, half-finished prototypes, screenshots of test results sent to herself at 2 a.m. There were almost no pictures of them together, not because they didn't exist, because they weren't meant to. Once, at a fundraising dinner, a journalist approached Graham and asked about his personal motivations for investing in health tech. Graham spoke fluently about his family history, his values, his desire to improve lives. Imani stood beside him, invisible and burning. Later that night, as they rode the elevator up to their apartment, she finally spoke. "You didn't mention me," she said, keeping her voice steady. Graham looked genuinely confused. "Mention you how?" "As your wife." The elevator chimed. The doors slid open. He stepped out first, already shifting into dismissal. "That wasn't relevant," he said lightly. "You know how these interviews work." Imani followed him into the apartment, the door closing behind them with a soft, definitive click. She stood there for a long moment, staring at their reflection in the glass wall, him adjusting his cufflinks, her standing still, half lit by the city beyond. Relevant, the word echoed uncomfortably. That night, as Graham slept, Imani scrolled through his photos again. Hundreds of faces, hundreds of moments. A carefully documented life that left no room for her to exist in public. She set her phone down and stared at the ceiling, understanding something she hadn't wanted to name. She hadn't been forgotten. She had been edited out. And the most dangerous erasure, she realized, isn't the kind that happens all at once. It's the kind you're taught to accept, frame by frame, until one day you look for yourself and can no longer find where you're supposed to be. The email arrived at 2:17 p.m., buried between a shipping update and a calendar reminder Graham had added without asking. Imani almost deleted it. The subject line was modest, careful, professional. Asia Pacific Frontier Innovation Prize. Shortlist notification. No exclamation points, no urgency, just enough neutrality to be overlooked by someone who had trained herself not to expect recognition. She opened it standing at the narrow counter in the guest room turned lab, one hand steadying a circuit board, the other scrolling. "Dear Ms. Brooks, we are pleased to inform you." Her breath caught halfway through the sentence. She read it again, then a third time, slower now, as if speed might undo it. "Shortlisted, top 5, out of more than 800 applicants across 12 countries. Her wearable, months of failed tests, sleepless nights, recalibrations scribbled on napkins, had made it." The room seemed to tilt slightly, like a camera adjusting focus. She sat down hard on the edge of the folding chair, pressing her fingers to her mouth to keep the sound inside. Joy rose first, bright, disorienting, almost painful. Then disbelief. Then something sharper, more dangerous. Hope. She forwarded the email to herself, just to see her name in the header again. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine it. Standing on a stage, her work described aloud, her name spoken clearly, without hesitation. A room full of people listening, not because of who she stood next to, but because of what she had built. She checked the date. The awards ceremony was in 10 days. Her first instinct was to tell Graham. That was the reflex love had trained into her. Share good news upward. Make it communal. Let him amplify it. She stood, smoothing her shirt, rehearsing the way she would say it casually, not too proud. "I heard back about something." Before she reached the doorway, she heard his voice. He was in the living room, phone pressed to his ear, tone low but relaxed. The windows were open, city noise threading through his words. "No, she won't be attending." Imani stopped. She didn't mean to listen. But her name, she, hung there, undeniable. "It's not the right moment," Graham continued. "She's still developing. I don't want to rush exposure." A pause, the faint sound of someone else speaking. "Yes, I know she's talented," he said, impatience slipping through the polish. "That's not the issue." Not the issue. Imani stepped closer to the doorway, the email still glowing in her hand like a fragile thing. "I'll be there, of course," Graham went on. Someone needs to represent quality in that category. He laughed then, easy, familiar. Imani felt the laugh land somewhere inside her chest and split. She leaned against the wall, the cool paint grounding her as the conversation continued. Logistics, seating, donors. Her future discussed like a scheduling inconvenience. When the call ended, Graham didn't turn around right away. He stood at the window, one hand in his pocket, looking out over the city as if it belonged to him. Imani watched him through the narrow opening of the door. The man she had loved. The man who had once told her he wanted the world to see her. She looked down at the email again. Shortlisted, chosen, acknowledged, and hidden. The realization didn't come as a scream. It came as clarity, cold, precise, impossible to argue with. This wasn't protection. It was containment. When Graham finally turned, he smiled at her reflexively. "Hey, I thought you were working." "I was," she said. Her voice sounded distant, even to her. "I got an email." "Oh?" He walked toward her, already reaching for his tablet. "Everything okay?" She held up her phone instead. He read it quickly, too quickly. The smile faltered, not with surprise, but calculation. His eyes flicked to the date, then away. "That's great," he said after a beat. "Really great." But he didn't touch her, didn't ask how she felt, didn't say, "Congratulations." "You knew," she said quietly. He exhaled. "It came through my office first. Advisory board overlap. And you didn't tell me. I was waiting for the right time." Imani nodded slowly. The pieces slid into place with a soft, devastating click. The whispers, the photos, the omissions, the way her life had been managed gently, persistently, until she barely recognized its outline. She looked at him, not angrily, not yet, but with a steadiness that made him uncomfortable. "You already decided," she said. It wasn't a question. Graham's jaw tightened. "You're taking this personally." She smiled then, small and sharp. "It is personal." For the first time since moving to Singapore, Imani didn't feel confused. She felt awake. And somewhere beneath the shock and the grief, something else began to stir. Something dangerous to a man like Graham Whitaker. The understanding that her silence had been doing his work for him. And that silence, finally, was about to end. The apartment felt smaller after that. Not physically, nothing had moved, but the walls seemed to listen now, the glass to observe. Every surface reflected a version of them that no longer aligned. Graham paced the living room with measured steps, the way he did when preparing an argument he believed would win. Imani sat at the edge of the couch, hands folded, posture still. She had stopped bracing herself. That was the difference he felt and couldn't name. "You're spiraling," he said gently, like a diagnosis. "This is one email, one award. It doesn't define your career." "It defines yours," she replied. He stopped, turned. "That's unfair." "Is it?" Her voice was calm, dangerously calm. "You told them I wouldn't attend. You decided my visibility without asking me." Graham sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You don't understand how this ecosystem works. There are expectations. Timing matters." "For who?" she asked. "Say it clearly." He looked away, out the window, at the city he loved because it made sense to him. Singapore is particular. There it was again, that word, polished, empty, a placeholder pretending to be an explanation. Particular how? Imani pressed. Particular about innovation or about who gets to represent it? He didn't answer. She stood then, slowly, deliberately, as if standing itself were a declaration. "Name one person at your firm who knows I'm your wife." "That's not—" "Name one," she repeated. Silence filled the room, thick and unforgiving. Graham opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. "People don't need to know everything about my personal life." "My existence isn't trivia," she said. "It's not a detail you disclose when it's convenient." "You're making this racial," he snapped, then immediately softened his tone. "I didn't mean—" "You did," she said. You just don't like hearing it. He crossed his arms, defensive now. This isn't about race. It's about optics, boards, investors, the way things are perceived. And how am I perceived? She asked. He hesitated. The hesitation was louder than any answer. Imani felt something settle in her chest. Not heartbreak, not rage, but certainty. The kind that arrives when the truth finally stops negotiating. You can't say it, she said quietly. You can't say the word because once you do, you can't pretend this is neutral. Graham's jaw tightened. You're reading intent where there is none. She laughed then, a short, broken sound that surprised them both. Intent doesn't erase impact. You erased me. That's not fair. No, she said, shaking her head. What's not fair is loving someone only when no one else is watching. He stepped closer, lowering his voice as if volume were the problem. I was protecting you. From what? She asked. From being seen next to you? He didn't answer. She moved toward the glass wall, looking out at the city lights scattered like a circuit board. Connections everywhere, power flowing invisibly. I left my job. I moved continents. I built my work in the margins of your life. And you still think this is about timing. You don't understand the pressure I'm under, he said, frustration breaking through. The scrutiny. One wrong association and what? She turned back to him. You lose credibility? The word hung there. Naked. He swallowed. In that moment, she saw it clearly. Not malice, not even hatred, but fear. Fear of being judged by people who would never risk what he risked. Fear of being associated with a woman whose excellence couldn't be controlled, whose presence asked questions he didn't want to answer. You didn't marry me despite the world, she said softly. You married me believing you could keep me separate from it. That's not... I'm black, she said, flat and unflinching. And you're afraid of what that costs you. The silence that followed was total. Graham sat down heavily, elbows on his knees, head in his hands. When he spoke, his voice was smaller. I thought I could manage it, keep things simple. For you, she said. He looked up at her then, really looked, as if seeing the distance he'd created for the first time. I do love you. She felt no comfort in the words. You love the version of me that doesn't complicate your story, she replied. The one who stays off camera. She took a breath, steady and deep. I won't do that anymore. Graham stood abruptly. So what, you want me to parade you around? Turn our marriage into a statement? I want you to stop hiding, she said. And if you can't, then stop calling this love. He stared at her, anger and fear warring across his face. You're overreacting. No, she said. I'm finally reacting accurately. That was the moment something broke between them. Not loudly, not dramatically, but cleanly. Like a thread pulled too far, finally snapping. Imani walked past him toward the guest room, toward the space where she had been allowed to exist. As she closed the door behind her, she understood something with devastating clarity. The most dangerous words aren't the ones people shout. They're the ones they refuse to say, because saying them would mean admitting who they really are. The awards ceremony took place on a Thursday night in a converted heritage hall near the Singapore River, a space dressed up to look impartial, progressive, global. Exposed bricks softened by warm lighting, white floral arrangements carefully chosen to photograph well. A stage built just high enough to elevate voices without empowering them too much. Imani arrived alone. No one checked her name at the door. No one asked who she was with. The volunteer scanned her badge, nodded once, and waved her through with the distracted efficiency reserved for people who were expected to blend in. She did. Inside, the room pulsed with ambition. Founders clustered near investors. Journalists hovered at the edges, glasses in hand, eyes sharp. Laughter moved in practiced crescendos. This was the sound of opportunity circulating. Imani stood near. Across the room, Graham Whitaker was exactly where he always was, the center of gravity. A semicircle of people leaned toward him as he spoke. He smiled easily, gestured lightly, exuded the comfort of a man who had never had to wonder whether he belonged. Someone clapped him on the shoulder. Someone else laughed too loudly at something he'd said. Imani watched without blinking. This was the man who had told her tonight wasn't the right moment. The lights dimmed. The hum of conversation softened into anticipation. The host took the stage, voice smooth and assured, speaking about innovation, courage in the future. Slides flashed behind him, words like impact, equity, disruption, carefully chosen, comfortably abstract. Imani felt strangely calm. Her category was announced third. Please welcome our finalists for the Asia-Pacific Frontier Innovation Prize. 5 names appeared on the screen. 4 men, 1 woman. Her name. There was polite applause, not thunderous, not dismissive. The kind reserved for people the room hadn't decided what to do with yet. Imani walked to the stage with steady steps, aware of the way eyes tracked her movement, assessing, categorizing. She accepted the certificate, thin and glossy, her name printed cleanly across the top. The host shook her hand, smiled for the camera, moved on. As she turned, she scanned the crowd instinctively. Graham wasn't looking at her. He stood near the bar now, head tilted toward his phone, thumbs scrolling. A man beside him spoke, but Graham nodded absently, attention elsewhere. He didn't look up once. The winner was announced minutes later. Applause erupted, louder this time, enthusiastic, relieved. A man from a prestigious accelerator in Europe. Solid work, safe work, the kind that reassured boards and donors that nothing fundamental would change. Imani clapped with the room, hands moving automatically. She felt the weight of the certificate in her grip. Not heavy enough to feel like recognition, too heavy to ignore. She should have left then. She knew that. Should have slipped out quietly, let the night pass, taken her dignity home and sat with it privately. That would have been clean, contained. Instead, she did something she hadn't planned. She walked toward Graham. The circle around him shifted instinctively as she approached. Polite smiles, curious glances. She stepped into the open space beside him and extended her hand to the man closest. Imani Brooks, she said clearly, I don't believe we've met. The man smiled, reflexive and warm. Of course, I've heard of your work. Congratulations. Then she turned. And this, she said, voice even, unhurried, is Graham Whitaker, my husband. The room changed temperature. It wasn't dramatic at first, just a subtle recalibration, a pause too long, a smile that froze mid-curve. Someone inhaled sharply and forgot to finish. Graham laughed, a short, brittle sound. Imani, he said, reaching for her arm. This isn't the time. She stepped just out of reach. My husband, she repeated, a fraction louder. We've been married for 3 years. Phones appeared, not openly, not yet, but hands shifted, angles adjusted. Someone near the edge raised their glass and lowered it again, uncertain. I'm sorry, one woman said, brows knitting. I didn't realize. You weren't supposed to, Imani replied. Graham's smile collapsed. You're being dramatic, he said through clenched teeth. Am I? She lifted her left hand, the ring catching the light. Simple, unassuming, unmissable. I've worn this every day. The circle widened. People stepped back, not out of judgment, but instinct. No one wanted to be too close to whatever this was becoming. This isn't appropriate, Graham hissed. Where was it appropriate? She asked. At the dinners I wasn't invited to, the meetings where I didn't exist, the night you told them I wouldn't attend without asking me. Someone's phone was up now. Not hidden, recording. Graham grabbed her arm, hard enough to leave an impression. We need to talk privately. She pulled free. The motion was sharp, audible, impossible to ignore. You've had 3 years of privacy, she said. Congratulations. She turned and walked away. Behind her, the room exhaled in fragments, whispers, gasps, the sudden realization that something had just fractured in public. The kind of fracture that couldn't be smoothed over with statements or spin. Outside, the night air was cool against her skin. The river reflected the city lights in broken lines. Imani stood there for a moment, breathing, heart pounding, not with fear, but with something close to relief. Inside that hall, a narrative had collapsed, and for the first time, she understood. Once the truth is spoken out loud, it doesn't belong to you anymore. It belongs to everyone who witnessed it. And nothing terrifies power more than that. 3 words, that was all it took. Not a speech, not an accusation, not a demand. My husband. They hung in the air long after Imani left the circle, long after the doors closed behind her, long after the music resumed and the host pretended nothing had happened. 3 ordinary words, rearranged into something dangerous. Inside the hall, no one quite knew where to stand anymore. Conversations restarted too loudly, then faltered. Laughter came out sharp, misplaced. People checked their phones with sudden urgency, thumbs moving faster than their faces could hide. A journalist near the back typed furiously, eyes flicking up every few seconds, as if afraid the truth might rearrange itself if unwatched. Graham Whitaker stood exactly where she'd left him. For the first time in his career, no one leaned in. Someone murmured his name. Another offered a polite smile that didn't invite reply. The semicircle that had once centered him dissolved into loose, uncomfortable fragments. He tried to speak, something about a misunderstanding, about timing, but the words landed flat, weightless. Explanations require authority. Authority had just slipped. Near the bar, a woman replayed the video she'd captured, eyes widening. She said it so calmly, she whispered to no one in particular. That's what makes it terrifying. The clip was already moving, first to a private group chat, then another, then a Slack channel reserved for founders and investors who believed themselves discreet. The same 10 seconds looped again and again. Imani's steady voice, Graham's reaching hand, the pull away. Context didn't matter. The moment spoke for itself. Outside, Imani walked without direction. The city unfolded around her in familiar routes she'd traveled alone for years. Past the river, past restaurants where she'd waited for dinners that never included her, past streets that had taught her how to be invisible without disappearing entirely. Her phone vibrated once, then again. She didn't look. She already knew. By the time she reached the quiet of her apartment building, the story had begun to form without her consent. Headlines would choose their angles. Commentators would debate her tone. Strangers would decide whether she was brave or reckless, dignified or disruptive. She leaned her forehead briefly against the cool metal of the elevator wall as it rose. 3 words. She thought about how long she'd practiced saying nothing, how carefully she'd edited herself, believing silence was the price of stability, how often she'd told herself, this isn't the moment. The doors opened. Inside the apartment, the lights were on. Graham sat on the couch, jacket discarded, phone in his hand. He looked up as she entered, eyes sharp with a fury that had nowhere to land. Do you have any idea what you've done? He demanded. She set her bag down slowly. Yes, you humiliated me. No, she said. I told the truth. You blindsided me in front of people who matter. People mattered when I didn't, she replied, removing her shoes with deliberate calm. That's the difference. He stood, pacing now, anger breaking through his composure. They're calling, partners, LPs, asking questions. Good. He stopped. Good? Let them ask, she said. I've been answering questions alone for years. He stared at her as if seeing her clearly for the first time, and not liking what clarity revealed. You didn't have to do it like that. How then? She asked. Quietly? In private? So you could decide which parts of me were acceptable again? Silence stretched between them, heavy and brittle. Outside, a notification chimed from his phone. Then another. He glanced down despite himself, and something in his face shifted. Not fear yet, but the dawning recognition of loss of control. Imani watched it happen without satisfaction. 3 words had done what years of patience never could. They had forced reality into the open, stripped of framing, stripped of permission. She realized then that the moment didn't belong to the gala, or the city, or the internet that was already dissecting it. It belonged to her. Because once you say the thing you've been trained not to say, once you claim the truth out loud, there is no version of the world where you can be made small again. 3 words, and everything had changed. By morning, the truth had acquired a strategy. Imani woke to silence, the heavy, anticipatory kind that follows impact. Graham was already gone, his side of the bed untouched, his charger missing from the nightstand. On the kitchen counter, his coffee mug sat rinsed and inverted, as if order itself might undo what had happened. Her phone lay where she'd left it, screen dark. She didn't reach for it right away. Outside, Singapore moved on. Traffic hummed. Towers caught the early light. The city was practiced at absorbing disruption and continuing forward as if nothing personal had occurred. But something had. When she finally picked up her phone, the screen bloomed with notifications. Messages stacked on messages. Unknown numbers. Familiar names she hadn't heard from in years. Are you okay? Is it true? That was intense. You're brave. Why didn't you leave sooner? She closed her eyes. Damage control had begun, not for her, but around her. Graham's firm released a statement before noon. It was immaculate. Symmetrical sentences, no names, no specifics. We respect all individuals and remain committed to diversity and inclusion. Recent events reflect a private matter that should not distract from our mission. Private matter. Imani read it once, then again, noting what wasn't there. No acknowledgement, no denial, no apology, just distance. By afternoon, the clip had crossed boundaries Graham couldn't manage. It escaped founder circles and entered public feeds. Tech blogs embedded it. Commentators slowed it down, replayed the moment her arm pulled free. Someone added subtitles. Someone else added music. Context fractured. Judgment multiplied. She watched none of it. Instead, she went to the guest room, the room that had never been called hers, and packed a single bag. Clothes, laptop, a notebook filled with sketches and equations. The essentials of a life she'd been allowed to maintain only in the margin. Her phone rang. Sophia's name lit up the screen. "Come stay with me," Sophia said before Imani could speak. "Don't argue." Imani didn't. That night, on a couch that smelled like laundry detergent and familiarity, she finally opened her phone again. The internet had done what it always did, flatten complexity into sides. Some praised her composure, called her powerful, iconic. Others questioned her motives, her timing, her emotional stability. Why air this publicly? She knew what she married into. Seems calculated. Why didn't she just leave quietly? Quietly. Imani scrolled past a thread dissecting her facial expression, her tone, her body language. Too calm, too cold, too emotional, too much. There it was, the trap she'd lived inside. If you stay silent, you disappear. If you speak, you're disruptive. There was no winning move in a game designed to erase you. Another notification surfaced. A forwarded email, internal, not meant for her. A partner at Graham's firm had written, "This complicates optics ahead of Q4. We need to reassess exposure." Exposure. She set the phone down. For the first time since the gala, something like anger arrived. Not sharp, not explosive, but solid, grounded, useful. This wasn't about humiliation, or embarrassment, or even betrayal. This was about power being interrupted. Graham had believed truth could be managed like a portfolio, that silence was an asset, that her invisibility was a small, necessary cost. He had been wrong. The next day, she met with a lawyer Sophia recommended. Alessandra was efficient, unsentimental, and kind in the way of people who had seen too much to be surprised. "The prenup is aggressive," Alessandra said, scanning pages. "Legal, but aggressive." "I don't want money," Imani said. "I want my work, my name, and space." Alessandra looked up. "That's a stronger position than you think." By evening, Graham texted, "We need to talk. This is getting out of hand. Imani stared at the message for a long moment, then set the phone face down. Damage control assumes there's something to contain. But some things, once spoken, refuse to return to silence. And Imani understood now. The story was no longer about saving face. It was about deciding whose life she was willing to protect. For the first time, the answer was hers. The papers were signed on a Wednesday morning, 48 hours after Imani filed. Alessandra had warned her it might happen quickly. Men like him don't fight when fighting risks exposure, she'd said, sliding the documents across the table. They move fast, quiet. They call it efficiency. Imani read every page anyway. The prenup was ruthless in its elegance. No shared assets, no claim to future earnings, no acknowledgement of unpaid labor, emotional or otherwise. It was designed by people who understood how to protect wealth, not marriage. Graham signed without comment. No protest, no bargaining, no sudden rediscovery of love. Just a pen moving smoothly across the page, as if closing a deal that had already outlived its usefulness. When Alessandra told her, Imani felt nothing at first. No collapse, no relief, just a hollow stillness, like a room after furniture has been removed. The shape of something remained, but the weight was gone. He didn't contest anything, Alessandra said. That's intentional. He wants this to disappear. Imani nodded. He always did. They met once more, briefly, in a neutral office that smelled faintly of toner and air conditioning. Graham arrived in a tailored suit, hair perfect, posture composed. The man who had built his life on appearances hadn't abandoned them yet. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly, not meeting her eyes. "Yes," she replied. "I do," he exhaled sharply. "You won't get anything." "I know." That seemed to unsettle him more than anger would have. "You walked away from a very comfortable life," he added, as if reminding her of a miscalculation. Imani looked at him then, really looked, at the man who had once promised partnership and delivered containment. "Comfort isn't the same as dignity," she said. "I'm done confusing the two." He watched her for a long moment, searching for leverage, finding none. "People will take my side," he said finally. "You know how this world works." She smiled, small and tired. "They probably will." That was the truth. Systems protect themselves. Power closes ranks. She had never expected applause. "But at least," she continued, standing, "they'll finally know I exist." The words landed harder than anything she could have shouted. That night, alone in Sophia's apartment, Imani lay awake listening to the city outside. Voices, traffic, the sound of lives continuing without permission. She thought about how quickly something she had once treated as permanent had dissolved. 48 hours. 3 years of silence undone in 2 days. The internet moved faster. Speculation exploded. Headlines framed the story in opposing ways. VC power implodes after gala incident. Founder exposes husband's double life. Private marriage becomes public scandal. Some comments were vicious, others generous, many confused. Why didn't she leave sooner? Why marry him at all? Why make it public? Each question carried the same accusation. Why didn't you make this easier for everyone else? Imani closed the browser. The divorce decree arrived electronically just after midnight. Final, unappealable, clean. She stared at her name at the top of the document. Imani Brooks. Unattached, unqualified. No hyphen, no asterisk, no explanation. For the first time in years, her name stood alone. She didn't cry. Instead, she opened her notebook and wrote a single sentence across the first blank page. "I am no longer negotiating my existence." The marriage had ended quietly, efficiently, the way Graham preferred. But what followed wouldn't be quiet at all. Because divorces end relationships. They don't end stories. And Imani's, finally, was only just beginning. The clip surfaced on a Tuesday. Not with an announcement, not with context, just 10 seconds, uploaded by an account with no profile picture and a username that suggested nothing more than proximity to power. It began mid-motion. Imani's voice, steady, unraised. My husband. Graham's hand entering the frame, her arm pulling free. The camera shook, corrected itself, held. 10 seconds was all it took. By noon, it had been reposted 100 times. By evening, 1,000. By nightfall, it had escaped the ecosystem Graham understood and entered one he didn't. Public timelines, stitched reactions, slowed down analyses with captions layered like verdicts. People argued about everything except what mattered. Her tone, too calm. Her timing, too public. Her face, too composed. Her body language, too confrontational. Someone wrote, "She knew what she married into." Someone else replied, "So did he." A tech columnist framed it as a cautionary tale about mixing personal and professional spheres. A podcaster called it a masterclass in restraint. Another labeled it reckless, warned founders about optics. Optics, again. The clip fractured into meaning depending on who held it. For some, it was a moment of courage. For others, a disruption they wished had remained theoretical. For a few, it was entertainment, something to consume between meetings and forget by morning. Imani watched none of it. Sophia did. "They're dragging him," she said one night, phone glowing in the dark. Group chats, investor threads, people are comparing stories. Comparing? Imani asked. Sophia nodded. Patterns, dinners without spouses, introductions that never quite land, women who were consultants for years. Imani closed her eyes. The clip had become a mirror, and mirrors make people uncomfortable. 2 days later, a longer version appeared. 30 seconds this time, clearer audio. Someone had been closer than anyone realized. The moment Graham said, "This isn't appropriate," the moment Imani replied, "Where was it appropriate?" That line caught fire. It became a caption, then a headline, then a question people started asking out loud. Where was it appropriate? Graham's firm issued another statement, longer this time, denser. Words like miscommunication, regret, commitment to values. Still no names, still no accountability. But something had shifted. Meetings were postponed. A conference panel quietly replaced him. A brand collaboration vanished from a press release without explanation. None of it was announced. None of it needed to be. Power rarely apologizes. It adjusts. A journalist reached out to Imani via email, careful, respectful. "I'd like to tell your story in your words." She didn't respond. Another followed, then another. Imani watched the requests accumulate like unopened letters at a door she wasn't ready to answer. Because she knew what would come next. They would want pain, but only the kind that fit. Strength, but only if it didn't accuse. Truth, but only if it remained palatable. She wasn't interested in being consumed. Late one evening, she scrolled once. Just once. She saw a comment buried deep in a thread, written by someone with no audience, no verification, no stake in the spectacle. "I didn't know women had to disappear so quietly for men to succeed. Thank you for saying it out loud." Imani put the phone down. That was the cost of the clip. Not exposure, not criticism, not even the loss Graham was now scrambling to contain. The cost was that the silence no longer belonged to him. The clip had escaped its moment. It was no longer about a marriage or a gala, or even a man who had miscalculated. It had become a question the room couldn't unhear. And once a question like that exists, once it circulates freely, uncontained, no amount of damage control can put it back where it came from. The clip kept moving. And with every share, something old loosened its grip. The internet doesn't forget, but more importantly, it remembers patterns. A week after the clip went viral, the narrative shifted, not louder but sharper. The spectacle faded, the curiosity remained. And in that quieter space, people began to look more closely. The first receipt surfaced on a Thursday night, a screenshot. No commentary, no emojis, just an internal email forwarded too many times to be fake. The sender's name was redacted, but the tone was unmistakable. "We should be cautious about placing Brooks front-facing. Optics could complicate donor confidence, especially given Whitaker's positioning. The timestamp predated the gala by 3 months. It spread fast, not because it was scandalous, but because it confirmed what many had felt and never been able to prove. That erasure wasn't accidental. It was coordinated. More followed. Decks where Imani's work appeared without her name. Slides labeled Team Innovation that were, in truth, her algorithms. Meeting notes suggesting her presence might distract from narrative clarity. Narrative clarity. People began to talk less about the confrontation and more about the structure that had made it possible. A journalist published a long-form piece tracing Graham Whitaker's public image against his private decisions. The article avoided melodrama. It didn't need it. It laid out dates, documents, quotes from anonymous sources who all said versions of the same thing. She was too visible. She didn't fit the story. He was worried about the room. The piece ended with a single line that was quoted more than any other. Erasure rarely looks like hate. More often, it looks like management. Imani read the article once, then closed it. Sophia watched her carefully. "You okay?" Imani nodded. "I'm not surprised." That was the most unsettling part. None of it felt new. What felt new was the way institutions began revising themselves in public. A conference quietly updated its website, adding Imani's name to a past panel she'd attended but never been credited for. A venture fund issued a statement acknowledging oversights in attribution practices. A prominent accelerator announced a task force, temporary, vague, but visible. Revisions without responsibility. Corrections without consequences. The design was familiar, acknowledged just enough to survive. Change language, not leadership. Graham's firm followed the script. They announced an internal review, hired an external consultant, paused his public-facing roles pending evaluation. The language was surgical. No blame, no admission, just distance. Imani didn't celebrate. She understood something many didn't yet. Institutions don't reform because of morality. They reform because silence becomes expensive. Another receipt emerged, a calendar invite from 2 years earlier. Subject line, Brooks' visibility strategy. Declined. That one broke something open, because strategy implied intention. People stopped asking why Imani hadn't spoken sooner. They started asking who benefited from her silence. Online, the conversation matured. Less heat, more depth. Black women in tech shared stories of being credited in footnotes, not headlines. Of being praised privately and sidelined publicly. Of being told to wait for the right moment that never arrived. A professor tweeted, "We don't gatekeep excellence, we gatekeep comfort." The tweet went everywhere. Imani sat at Sophia's kitchen table, laptop open, watching a different kind of momentum build, not around her, but beyond her. The story was no longer asking her to perform pain. It was asking institutions to explain themselves. She received an email from the awards committee, polite, formal, careful. Upon review of the final voting tallies, it appears there were discrepancies in the presentation of results. We would like to discuss next steps to ensure proper recognition. She read it twice. Discrepancies, not bias, not pressure, not interference. Just discrepancies. She closed the laptop. Receives had a way of clarifying things, of stripping away euphemism, of turning suspicion into record. And revisions, no matter how polished, couldn't undo what had already been revealed. The system was adjusting again. But Imani was no longer interested in watching it move around her. She had learned the difference between being corrected and being changed, and she was done accepting the first as a substitute for the second. The call came on a Monday morning, the kind that arrives with practiced humility. Imani was sitting at Sophia's kitchen table, laptop open, coffee untouched, when the number flashed across her screen. International, unfamiliar, important by implication. She answered without expectation. "Miss Brooks," the voice said warmly, "thank you for taking the time. This is Adrian Coe from the Asia Pacific Frontier Innovation Prize Committee." Imani waited. "We've completed an internal review," he continued, choosing each word with care. There were irregularities in how the final results were presented. Irregularities. The word slid easily into the space where truth should have lived. When we reviewed the original tallies, Adrian went on, your project actually ranked first. The silence on Imani's end was long enough to become noticeable. We'd like to correct that, he said quickly. Publicly. A revised ceremony, full recognition, press coverage, the works. Make it right. The phrase wasn't spoken, but it hovered between them, familiar and heavy. Imani had heard versions of it her entire career. When credit was misplaced, when timelines shifted, when the cost of fairness suddenly outweighed its inconvenience. I see, she said finally. We believe this is an opportunity, Adrian added, sensing hesitation, to demonstrate accountability, growth. Growth for whom? Imani closed her eyes briefly, thinking of the gala hall, the polite applause, the way her name had been spoken like a footnote. She thought of the emails now circulating, the language that had shaped her absence long before anyone called it a mistake. Was there pressure? She asked. A pause, short, calculated. There were concerns raised, Adrian said, from stakeholders. Stakeholders, not creators, not patients, not the people whose lives her work could change, just stakeholders. And now those concerns are gone? She asked. Circumstances have evolved, he replied. Public understanding has shifted. Imani smiled, though no one could see it. So has my understanding. She straightened in her chair. I appreciate the acknowledgement, truly, but I'm not interested in a revised ceremony. Adrian inhaled sharply. I'm sorry? I'm declining, she said, voice steady. I don't want an award given because it's safer now. There it was, the moment he hadn't anticipated. Miss Brooks, he said carefully, this could be significant for your career. It already is, she replied, just not in the way you mean. He tried again. We want to make this right. Imani let the words settle. No, she said. You want to make it quiet. The line landed cleanly. This isn't about punishment, Adrian said. It's about fairness. Fairness doesn't arrive retroactively, she replied, and it doesn't come with conditions. On the other end, papers shifted. A throat cleared. We're prepared to offer substantial visibility, he said. A platform. Imani thought of the word optics, how often it had been used to shrink her. Visibility that depends on your discomfort easing isn't visibility, she said. It's permission. Silence stretched. I don't want pity, she continued. I don't want reparations disguised as recognition. And I don't want to be the example you use to prove you've learned, without changing anything underneath. Adrian exhaled slowly. You're turning down a first-place award. Yes. May I ask why? She didn't hesitate. Because the moment I accept scraps from people who starve me, she said, I validate their power to decide when I'm allowed to eat. The call ended politely, respectfully, uncomfortably. Imani set the phone down and stared at the tabletop, the grain of the wood grounding her. Her hands were steady. Her chest felt light. Sophia leaned against the counter, having caught enough of the conversation to understand the shape of it. You turned it down. I did. Sophia shook her head slowly, half in awe, half in concern. You know people are going to say you're difficult. They already do. And that you're sabotaging yourself. Imani stood, moving toward the window. I spent years being manageable. It didn't protect me. Outside, the city moved. Buses, pedestrians, lives colliding and continuing. She thought of how often she'd been told to wait, to be patient, to trust the process. The process had trusted itself. I don't need their correction, she said. I need my autonomy. That afternoon, emails arrived. Some confused, some admiring, some sharply critical. A think piece framed her decision as a risky refusal. Another called it an uncompromising stand. Both missed the point. This wasn't about bravery. It was about refusing to let institutions rewrite harm as growth without doing the work. Imani opened a new document on her laptop. The page was blank, expectant. She typed a subject line, proposal, independent launch. No committee, no retroactive applause, no waiting for permission. Just work, on her terms. The world would keep offering to make it right. But she had learned something essential. Some things aren't fixed by correction. They're fixed by walking away and building something that never needed their approval in the first place. Imani didn't rebuild her life in a dramatic moment. There was no cinematic sunrise, no triumphant music, no instant clarity. There was only work, the kind that stains your hands and empties your body before it fills your spirit. She rented a corner in a shared lab space on the edge of the city, far from glass towers and donor luncheons. The building had once been a logistics warehouse. Now it held 12 startups in various stages of belief and desperation. The walls were scuffed, the floors uneven. The air smelled faintly of metal, coffee, and ambition that hadn't yet learned how to behave. Her space was small, one workbench, one aging 3D printer, a whiteboard with ghosted equations from whoever had occupied it before. No doors, no privacy. It was perfect. She worked longer hours than she ever had in Graham's apartment, because now no one was managing her presence. No one was deciding when her work was ready to be seen. Every choice was hers, and the responsibility was terrifying. Money was tight. The divorce had been clean, but costly in its own way. No shared resources, no safety net disguised as partnership. She lived simply, counted expenses, said no to things she wanted, and yes to things that mattered. Some nights, exhaustion pressed so heavily on her chest that she wondered if walking away had been a mistake, if comfort, however conditional, might have been easier. Then she remembered what comfort had cost her. The prototype evolved slowly. Iterations failed. Sensors misfired. Datasets revealed biases she had to dismantle, line by line. She rebuilt the algorithm to center populations medical technology had historically ignored. Black women, older patients, people with comorbidities that made investors nervous. This wasn't optimization. It was correction. Other founders noticed her before the press did. A woman across the lab, an AI ethicist, started bringing her coffee without asking. A hardware engineer offered spare parts and unsolicited but useful critiques. No one asked her who she was connected to. They asked what she was building. "You're angry," one of them said one evening, watching her tear apart a faulty casing. "I am," Imani replied, not looking up. "Good," he said. Anger sharpens things. The internet hadn't forgotten her. Messages arrived daily, from women in tech, from students, from founders who had watched the clip and felt something click inside them. Some thanked her. Some asked how to survive similar situations. Some just said, "I thought it was only me," she answered when she could. Not with platitudes, with honesty. She started hosting informal weekend sessions in the lab. No branding, no sponsors. Just space, whiteboards, hard conversations about ownership, visibility, and the cost of silence. Word spread quietly, the way real things do. What she was building extended beyond the device. She was building infrastructure for people who had been edited out of the story. The offers came eventually. Panels, interviews, a publisher asking for a proposal, a foundation interested in supporting her narrative. She declined most of them, not because she was afraid of attention, but because she was done letting others shape it. Burnout hovered constantly. There were mornings she stared at the lab door, fingers on the handle, body begging for rest she couldn't afford. Nights she slept on the floor between equipment because going home felt like wasted time. But something else grew alongside the fatigue: integrity. She was no longer translating herself, no longer trimming language to make it easier to swallow, no longer shrinking ideas so they'd fit inside someone else's comfort. They couldn't edit her now. There was no version of her life they controlled. One evening, as she packed up to leave, she caught her reflection in the darkened window, hair pulled back, hands marked with grease and ink, eyes tired but focused. She barely recognized the woman staring back, not because she was unfamiliar, because she was uncontained. This version of herself didn't ask to be included. She didn't wait to be validated. She didn't negotiate her worth with rooms that had already decided who belonged. She built anyway, and slowly, inevitably, the world began adjusting around her, not because it had learned, but because it could no longer ignore what refused to be edited out. Singapore looked flawless that night. The city always did when it wanted something. Glass towers cut clean lines into the sky, lights reflecting off the bay like a carefully edited memory. The gala hall shimmered, larger than before, louder, more deliberate. Twice the cameras, twice the press, every detail calibrated to signal progress. Imani Brooks stood alone at the edge of it all, not hit centered. The invitation had come months earlier, wrapped in language about growth, learning, moving forward. Singapore wanted to honor her now, not because it had changed, but because she had made silence impossible. When she entered, the room shifted again, not with surprise this time, but recognition. People turned, phones lifted openly, whispers followed her movement like a tide. She wore a dress she designed herself, structured, unapologetic, refusing softness for the sake of comfort. A dress that said, "I am not here to be agreeable. I am here to exist." Somewhere near the back of the room, Graham Whitaker stood alone. He looked smaller than she remembered. Not ruined, not broken, just displaced. The crowd moved around him without effort, the way power does when it's decided you no longer represent the future. Their eyes met once. Imani didn't look away. She didn't smile, either. He was no longer a conflict. He was context. At 8 o'clock sharp, the lights dimmed. The host stepped forward, voice polished, words carefully chosen. "Tonight," he said, "we celebrate innovation that challenges not just markets, but systems." Applause rose. Imani walked onto the stage without hesitation. When she reached the podium, she didn't thank the city. She didn't thank the institutions. She didn't perform gratitude for an apology that had arrived late and only after pressure. Instead, she spoke the truth. "A year ago," she began, voice steady, "I stood in this city and said 3 words that changed my life." The room went silent. "I said them because I was tired of being erased, because I had learned that silence doesn't protect you. It protects the people benefiting from it." She didn't name Graham. She didn't need to. "I was told I was too disruptive, too visible, too much," she continued. "But here's what I know now. You're not too much. You're just in rooms built too small." The words landed hard. Some people stood, some didn't. That didn't matter. What mattered was that she wasn't asking permission anymore. After the applause, thunderous, uneven, real, Imani stepped outside onto the terrace. The night air was cool, honest. Sophia joined her, wrapping a coat around her shoulders. "You did it," Sophia said softly. Imani shook her head, smiling. "No, I chose myself." Below them, Singapore glittered, still powerful, still complicated, still learning too slowly. But tonight, it hadn't rewritten her story. She had. And if this story moved you, if you've ever been silenced, edited, or told to wait your turn, make sure to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and follow the channel for more stories about reclaiming power, visibility, and self-worth. Because visibility isn't given, it's claimed. And once you stop asking for permission to exist, you become impossible to ignore.